I would like to give thanks to this morning's superb panelists and to Professor Diana Davis and Professor Isha Ray for their superb moderating. What a terrific start for the day. And I want, now that there are some folks here who were not here this morning, to give thanks in particular to our partners and co-sponsors, given what a collaborative event this conference has been. Our co-organizers at the College of Natural Resources, as well as our co-sponsors at the Goldman School of Public Policy, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Friends of the Arava Institute, the College of Environmental Design, the Blum Center for Developing Economies, the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, and the Wheeler Institute for Water Policy at the Law School, which you'll hear about in a moment, and the university's Institute for International Studies. And in general, to welcome all of you who joined us over the morning from the Berkeley law community, as well as from the program on Israel Studies. Given the key intersections of environmental law, science, politics, and society that are so much at the heart of this conference, and given the particular relevance of the issues we're discussing today to the California mindset, as we're mired in our state's worst drought, or perhaps second worst drought in history, it's particularly appropriate, I think, to welcome the law school's Professor Holly Doremus to make some remarks on behalf of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment to all of us. Holly Doremus is the James H. House and Hiram H. Hurd Professor of Environmental Regulation and the co-director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, as well as director of the law school's environmental law program. Holly's a leading scholar and phenomenal teacher in the areas of environmental law, natural resources law, and law in science. She brings a strong background in life sciences and a commitment to interdisciplinary teaching and scholarship to her work at Berkeley. She earned her PhD in plant psychology. I'm sorry, that would be something. That's truly interdisciplinary. Well, I had to get you guys to listen somehow. Plant physiology from Cornell University, and was a postdoc at the University of Missouri before making the transition to law. And she's taught in the ecology program at UC Davis, here on campus in the College of Natural Resources, and at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. She received her JD and environmental law certificate from Berkeley Law, where she was editor of the Ecology Law Quarterly, and then clerked for Judge Darmot O'Scanlan at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and then practiced municipal and land use law before teaching at the University of Oregon, and then UC Davis, and now, of course, here at Berkeley. And Holly has really brought so many students from law to the environment, and from environmental sciences to the law, and has built bridges in so many other ways. In that light, I'm excited to have her come and help us build another one today. Please welcome Holly Doremus.
Well, since I know this is your lunch hour and you've already been sitting all morning listening to talks and you'll be sitting all afternoon listening to talks, I'm going to try to keep my remarks shorter than Ken's introduction. That would be a great goal. Huh? So I wanted to first thank Ken and Rebecca for putting together this really interesting and really different from what we usually see here event. And I want to thank all the participants for coming, for sharing your knowledge and your perspectives with us. And of course, I want to thank Ken and Rebecca for including me in this event. You know, this is a fabulous topic. It might seem, when you just read the title of the conference, a little bit odd to be doing it at UC Berkeley. But I think actually this is a wonderful place to be doing it in a number of reasons. Of course, this is a leading national and international research university. It's a place where we have interests in our own backyard and throughout the world, and where we're able to draw lessons from throughout the world for our backyard, and hopefully a little bit vice versa as well. UC Berkeley has outstanding interdisciplinary water strengths, as you may already have heard. Some of this, I'm sorry I couldn't join you this morning. Teaching so gets in the way of things that we might want to do. But our strengths range from inquiry into water quality, inquiry into water allocation, technological fixes to water problems, the science and the economics of impacts that water problems have, of their consequences, and of course, what policy levers are available and how they might be pulled. We have the Berkeley Water Center. We have an NSF-funded Renew It. I don't remember what that stands for, but it's largely about water and wastewater infrastructure from the engineering perspective. We have the Berkeley Energy and Climate Institute, which has, among other things, among other interests, a water focus. And of course, as Ken mentioned, we have the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, and its Wheeler Institute for Water Law and Policy. Let's see, I think Mike Kaparsky, who's our Associate Director for the Wheeler Institute, is there, and sitting next to him is Nell Nyland, who's a fellow at the Wheeler Institute. Also very involved in our work is Janie Foley-Hein, who's the Executive Director of CLE. And the Wheeler Institute is working now and working up a number of projects, some work on innovation in water systems, in water management, where we are trying to put together a coherent project on allocation of water under shortage, using this year's drought as a case study. We're working on emerging threats to water quality, et cetera. Berkeley is, as I've said, it's a fabulous, has fabulous richness of engagement and interest and perspectives on water problems. Our Berkeley water community has recently suffered a very serious loss, and I just wanted to say a little bit about Professor Joe Sachs, who passed away over the weekend. Joe Sachs was the leading authority on Western water law, the leading authority on California water law, in particular on groundwater regulation or the lack thereof in California, and a forceful advocate for fair, efficient management of water resources in a way that recognizes both public interests and private interests in water. I think there's been quite a bit said today about the ways that water crosses that public and private divide. Joe was interested in all sorts of property that bridge that divide, but especially in the ways that water did so. He had been retired from teaching here for several years, but Joe was still deeply engaged in writing about the state's water conflicts. He wrote a great paper that was just published this summer about the Delta water conflicts, and in the public debates in litigation over water in the state, and in legislative and regulatory debates about that. So I think I at least want to really acknowledge the leading role that Joe Sachs has had in making Berkeley a great center for water policy work, and the ways that all of us here at Berkeley hope to carry on in his spirit. For the future, I think, well, at the university level, we have relatively recently come to the idea that interdisciplinary work is useful, important, feasible. Water is a great place to reach across disciplinary boundaries. There are so many aspects to water problems: scientific aspects, natural science aspects, social science aspects, engineering aspects, legal aspects, humanities, history, those sorts of things. So water problems really call for that kind of interdisciplinary study. And I think we've also, maybe this is just me also, but I think it's more broadly as institutions, we've come to see the importance of collaborative work, not just across disciplines, but across places, across locations, across political jurisdictions, both collaborative and comparative work, and what we can learn from that kind of work. So California is a very different place in many ways than Israel and Palestine are, but there are also important similarities in the kinds of problems we're facing and ways that we can surely learn from one another. So I just wanted to say a little bit about, Kenny mentioned our current drought, our water shortage issues here in California right now. Calendar year 2013 was the driest on record for many parts of California. The governor declared a drought emergency in January, and since then we've been lucky enough to have some rain, but we are still well below our average. I think we're about 45% of average for right now, and that's coming on the heels of 2 prior dry years. So we are in a serious drought situation. I think the ways that the state water board and Department of Water Resources categorize droughts, we're in the worst category for a big chunk of the central state and the San Joaquin Valley, and nearly so elsewhere, both north and south of the state. Surface water deliveries in California this year are expected to be cut really to the bone. We're talking about literally zero allocations, zero deliveries from the State Water Project, which serves a number of cities in the Bay Area and in Southern California, and a large acreage of agricultural land. Since we've recently had some rain, it may be that they're not literally at zero, but those deliveries are going to be very, very low. We also are probably looking at historically low deliveries from the federal Central Valley Project. And so that's just surface water deliveries, and we're facing enormous challenges to our groundwater particularly in some areas that are located higher up in granitic sorts of basins. There are places where municipalities expect their wells to go dry this summer. So this is a very, very serious drought, and we are already jockeying over who's going to take the hit, who will bear the costs, cities versus farms versus other farms, because we have farmers in the Sacramento Valley whose interests are opposed to farmers in the San Joaquin Valley, farmers who depend on surface water versus farmers who depend on groundwater. And of course, we also have the interests of environmental protection that come in there somewhere. We don't know whether and to what extent environmental protections might be relaxed. There are efforts to do that in a variety of ways already. And we don't know whether and to what extent water transfers can be used effectively to respond to shortage, to move water from more flexible to less flexible demands. There's very high-profile arguments going on between the White House and some legislators about whether California's current drought is due to climate change or not. Here in California, I would think most of us don't care. It doesn't matter. We have to deal with it. We have this serious drought regardless of whether it's caused by climate change. But we're also aware that many of the models of climate change show decreasing precipitation in the Southwest, and parts of California are in those models. And there's no question, we can already observe that the changing seasonality of water here, which really matters since snowpack is our single largest reservoir. If less of our water falls as snow, we have less of that storage reservoir. Whatever your views on anthropogenic climate change, it's indisputable that California is and has been in a Mediterranean climate. Mediterranean climates, like ours, historically are characterized by very high precipitation variability. And we have that. California has always been a place where droughts are followed by wet years. There's no such thing, as they say, as an average water year in California, right? There are extremes at both ends. And if you juxtapose that history of variability, which may be exacerbated by climate change, but even if you take that out of the equation, history of variability, increasing population pressure, we need to learn to make do with less water per capita and to be prepared to deal with severe droughts, with extreme dry years. In other words, we have to have some flexibility built into our systems. As we're trying to learn about those sorts of things, how to deal with shortages, and by the way, I should say we also have questions about the human rights and water, which was just discussed in the last panel. The California State Legislature recently declared that there is a human right to water. You may know that the United States is not always enthusiastic about recognizing human rights under that term at the national level. But California has said that there is, at least in this state, a human right to water, and we're trying to figure out what that means in terms of our water management systems, and how it might be implemented. So as we're trying to learn about these kinds of things, I think it's very helpful to talk to others from other systems with knowledge of other places. Our problems have similarities, they have differences. Our contexts, legal, social, otherwise, have similarities and differences. We shouldn't be naive and think we can apply what's being done in the Middle East in California or vice versa. We can't just import things, but we can provide a mirror for one another, I think, in some important ways. We can help each other recognize potentials and possibilities and tools that we might think about. So I think this conference is a great start on more of that kind of interaction, not just making us aware of the nature and the scope and the challenges of the problems in the Middle East, but also allowing people who work in that system to get to know some of the folks here and some of the folks from other parts of the world that are here today. Start building the kinds of relationships that will help us work more collaboratively in the future. So again, thanks so much to Ken and Rebecca for organizing this, and enjoy your afternoon.
So we will now hear a little bit about our this panel's participants from Professor Erica Weintel from Duke University. Erica is a can I say you're a political scientist?
I am.
Political scientist working in the environmental policy on environmental policy issues, and spent some time also working in Israel. And we'll go from there. Sure. We'll take it from there.
Sure. I'm from the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke, and I have the pleasure this afternoon of moderating the panel on Water Across Borders, the Politics of Peace and Collaboration. And so I'm just going to since we have 4 presenters this afternoon, which means we're even more packed than the morning, and I can see the room is full where everybody wants to hear our presentations, I'm going to just briefly introduce the presenters and then have them get up in the order that they're on the program to present, and I'm going to keep them to 15 minutes of presentation. I have lots of signs with the time limits so that we can have a conversation after the presentations, given the nature of the topic on peace and collaboration or cooperation. So I'm going to begin just briefly with Alon Tal, because his biography can go on for pages and pages, and I've already introduced him earlier this year, so this time I get to be very brief. Simply, Alon Tal is someone who merges the world of activism and scholarship. He is currently on the faculty of Ben-Gurion University and is on leave at Stanford University this year, working on a new book. He has been someone who's very actively engaged both in politics and as a practitioner. He was co-chairman of Israel's Green Party. He was the founding director of Adam Teva V'Din, the Israel Union for Environmental Defense. He helped found the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, and he's won many prizes, most notably the Charles Bronfman Humanitarian Prize for Environmental Leadership. After Professor Tal, we will turn to Professor Fischhandler, who is on the faculty of Hebrew University in the Department of Geography. He is also someone who is extremely prolific in the area of environmental conflict resolution, natural resource management, and governance. He works on transboundary water institutions in the Middle East, and many other topics. I'm just going to leave it there related to peace studies and geography. After that, we will have, if I'm going in the correct order, we will turn to Monter Hind, who is the Director General of the Palestinian Wastewater Engineers Group. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. He has worked with numerous government agencies on the topic of large-scale wastewater management, and he has been actively involved with, most recently, a project with the European Union. So he is someone who will bring, hopefully, a very hands-on perspective to the issue of wastewater management between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And also working on this topic is Dr. Clive Lipshin, who is the director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management at the Arava Institute. And he has a background, a PhD in resource ecology from both Berkeley's competitor and our competitor from Michigan. And he has been on the faculty of the Arava Institute since 2003 and is also very much engaged in collaborative efforts between Israelis and Palestinians. So I will turn it over to Alon.
Thanks very much, Erica, and good afternoon to one and all. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, mostly Mary, for all the work she did, and it's really great to be here. One of the refreshing things that one picks up when one runs for Knesset is you realize that you can actually talk to a group and not have to use PowerPoint. So I decided that to keep things short and maybe be a little bit more provocative than somehow PowerPoint seems to weigh us down. So I'm just going to say a few thoughts that I have, and I realized as I got here, on my way here, that this is a auspicious year for me because this is 20 years since the first time which I actually went to a conference on water in 1994 in Zurich. The Truman Institute brought, for the first time, I think, a group of Israelis and Palestinians to talk together about this. And I remember a few things that were said then, which I kind of stuck in my head and I repeated, and I'll start with sort of the punchline, which was somebody stood up, and I don't know who it was, and he said at the time, you know, in those days it was $1 per cubic meter of water. And he said, there's 300 million cubic meters of water about which Israel and the Palestinians are arguing. That's $300 million. Compare that to the price of an F-15 fighter jet. You don't go to war over $300 million. Today, in 2014 dollars, we can say You don't go to war over $154 million. If we take the price of desalination and how much it's gone down and how easy it is to produce water at a relatively inexpensive rate. And the question that I guess that I wanted to sort of throw out as I start is, to what extent has this technological breakthrough, which like it or not, it is with us to stay. Israel's facing, just like California, a very dry year. I think about 65% of the rainfall that we have usually has come down. But unlike California and unlike our neighbors in Jordan, most of the water managers in Israel sleep very well because we have made this shift to a desalinized water management system. So this is not the place or time to talk about the environmental consequences, and they exist. I don't want to be dismissive of the energy demands or the effect of the brine as it's discharged in the Mediterranean, or potential effect, because I don't think we've seen anything yet. But the fact of the matter is that Israel has 50% more water today than ever it is, and just about all of our municipal water is coming from the sea. So in the same way that Joseph Sachs was justifiably mentioned in the previous speaker, and as somebody, I never met Joseph Sachs, but I certainly read about the public trust when I went to law school and what a giant he was. This was also a hard year for us in Israeli environmental community because of the passage of Hillel Shuval, who was also a great thinker and I think spoke at Berkeley several times on these issues. And he always used to talk about the hydrohysteria and the need to diffuse it. The hydrohysteria which so informed and distorted the debate over water resources between Israel and the Palestinians. And the truth of the matter is that when I think about the whole transition to a desalinized water system for Israel, on the one hand, there is the trauma of somebody who for years preaches the gospel of sustainability and goes around telling the world we've got to conserve and we've got to cut back and we can't consume so much because we live on a planet called Spaceship Earth and there's only so much water resources. And then all of a sudden, the engineers from Ben Gurion University developed these amazing membranes, and all of a sudden we can have all the water we want. There's never really going to be a problem with providing basic water needs, at least for those who live within a reasonable distance of the sea. So although I have a problem with what that means or how it might be taken in terms of giving a victory to the cornucopians and the technological optimists, I do think that there are possible benefits on the geopolitical realm which trump my discomfort with unlimited water resources. And that's why I kind of think when we think about water now, whenever I was running around the campaign trail recently, I was always saying, in the Middle East, the past is the enemy of the future. And I would say in the water resource world, ideology is the enemy of hydrology, or ideology is the enemy of efficiency. Because in trying to reach an equitable solution with the Palestinians, and I know that very few people in this room would need to be convinced that we don't want to go with riparian rights and we don't want to go with historic rights, we want to find something in the Helsinki rules about sharing the water equitably. Sticking to the old ideologies doesn't make sense. And indeed, I would argue that anybody who wants to make the water issue an issue of sovereignty and rights, which has been a traditional position, which is totally justified from perhaps the Palestinian perspective, is making a mistake. And why do I think that's a mistake? I think that pragmatism needs to be our shared ideology, and that's because without it, the reality is that 45% of the water on the West Bank is being provided by Mikorot. Rather than getting more independence and autonomy, this dragging on the water debate has created a situation where Israel feels a need to supply for the humanitarian needs of the civilians, and more systems are linked to the Israeli system. So I would think that we want to start thinking about water differently. The fact that we can produce water so cheaply means that we can start thinking about water as a commodity. And although anybody who does any kind of a review of the environmental perspective on privatization of water is aware of all the pitfalls, the drop in service that people are expecting, and the profligate profits which leads to a drop in what the public receives. But the truth of the matter is, after now almost a decade of experience in Israel with desalination, I don't see any of those drawbacks. Strong regulation and good engineering and efficient private management have led to a situation where we get water inexpensively, at high quality, just as was promised in the contract, and it's BOT. So another 10 years, the Ashkelon plant will be coming back to the Israeli people. So into that kind of thing, we might want to rethink this notion of water as such a symbol of nationalism and start thinking about it as a commodity. I think this is particularly important when I discuss things with my Palestinian colleagues, because we have to recognize that just like she mentioned, the change in precipitation patterns they are expecting in California, in Israel it's fairly clear. I mean, climate change is not the gloomy projections of Al Gore. It is a new reality in terms of rainfall, if we look at the past 20 years. And so even if Palestinians receive all of the mountain aquifer, which is the shared resource about which we argue, it's not going to be enough. It's not enough now, and surely not when we look at the population momentum and what the needs will be in the future. Last week, some of us here, one-third was there, and Clive, a few of us were at American University, and we were very privileged to have the Minister of Water from Jordan Skype in. And he has the hardest job in the world because it was the third most water-scarce country on the planet, and then all of a sudden he got a 6-month period, a 20% increase in population. The second largest city in Jordan is the 1.2 million Syrians who are now camped there, and they need water. And his situation is untenable. And it led to something very interesting that somebody pointed out was really, I think, historic. For the first time, the Jordanians came to the Israelis and said, forget the treaties, we need to buy water. Can we buy some water from you? You're producing a lot, you have a surfeit, you have too much. And this was a change. I'm not so sure it's a change for the worse, given the geopolitical implications of what we've seen up until now. Must be about 5 years ago, we started a process, a colleague of mine, Alfred Abedrabo, who at the time was chairman of the chemistry department, a water chemist from Bethlehem University, and it turned into a book called Water Wisdom. And we brought together 15 Israeli and 15 Palestinian experts on water, and we broke them into groups of 2. So we had 2 people writing about culture and water. That was Clive's chapter. We had people talking about drinking water standards, 1 Israeli, 1 Palestinian, talking about the mountain aquifer, Gaza, you name it. And then we brought everybody, after they'd written their perspectives, how did they see these issues? We all went over to Amman, and we sat down and talked and tried to map out about what are we disagreeing about. And Alfred and my conclusion as we sort of edited the book was that the gaps are extremely small, and most of them have been closed by this new production capability with water, which is so inexpensive that already many Israeli farmers are thinking, gosh, I can produce avocados and flowers and all kinds of other high-end produce with desalinized water. So I would like to think, as I wrap up my opening comments, that as we look ahead, 2 things. First of all, it is time that we decouple water from the overall peace process. For too long, water has been a hostage of the stalemate between Israel and its neighbors. It's clear why Israel, in a negotiating table, took this position. I think it's legitimate. When you have 10 major issues you disagree about, you don't unilaterally concede the one you can actually give something on, and that would be water. But I think the humanitarian considerations trump it. And more than that, I think that the statement that we could make as we move toward an agreement, which I hope would increase the possibility that the water in the region could be looked at as a regional commodity, and we could have a regional market. Because if you can indeed produce water for 50 cents for 1,000 liters of water, and think about that, and some of you are walking around with bottles of water, how much do those water cost? This is 1,000 liters of water we can make, which is pure H2O. It's better than any of that bottled water you're getting. So at that price, isn't it time that perhaps we start looking at this a little more rationally, and from the Israeli point of view, I think a little more compassionately, and reach a real solution which will give Palestinians the resources that they deserve and have a right to, and the independence which they seek, and at the same time produce a more stable hydrological reality for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alon. You've set a great example, staying under the time limit. We will see if Itai will be able to match that.
Chance.
That doesn't mean you get to take a few extra.
No, I do.
You can have those on me.
Okay.
But I will
So
take
as opposed to Alon that discussed issues of fresh water, let me switch to wastewater, and my presentation is on the issue of how to divide the cost of wastewater infrastructure. So just to start with some background, we now know that there is around 60 million cubic meters of untreated wastewater discharged to the West Bank. The majority of the wastewater comes from Palestinian origin. There is still some wastewater that comes from a few Israeli settlements, and it's a pretty bad wastewater, and I guess that you are asking, so who cares? So there are 3 reasons why we should care. The first one has to do with the fact that since the mid-80s, Israel has been trying to rehabilitate its coastal streams, and there is no point to rehabilitate the downstream while the upstream is polluted. On top of it, no one likes to live next to running wastewater, and there are Palestinian and Israeli communities along those streams. And on top of it, and maybe most importantly, there is the issue of polluting the mountain aquifer, and we know how important the mountain aquifer both for the Israelis and the Palestinians. You can see here a map I did several years ago that depicts the transboundary basins, and I refer to them as transboundary because they transcend the green line. And you could also see the water divide, which means that any drop of water west of the water divide can go all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Any drop of water eastern of the Mediterranean divide will go, potentially can go all the way to the Dead Sea. And you could see some pollution sources. For example, Jenin, the Palestinian city on the Kishon, and Tulkarem and Nablus on the Alexander, and the Israeli settlement Ariel, and the Palestinian village Salfit on the Yarkon, and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty bad situation. And it's quite amazing that in the last 20 years, both the Israelis and the Palestinians have been negotiating the need to build new wastewater infrastructure on the West Bank. And they established until now only one facility on the West Bank to treat the wastewater of El Bire, and which also treats the wastewater of 2 Israeli settlements. Some nice pictures. Unfortunately, we can't take you there. We don't have the budget. But as you can imagine, that's not fresh water. It's wastewater that comes from the city of Jerusalem, from its eastern side, which is the Israeli responsibility. There are many reasons, many obstacles for the Palestinians not being able to treat their wastewater. I would focus on one issue which relates to the cost of wastewater infrastructure. So I guess you're asking, what are the options for dividing the cost of wastewater infrastructure? So when I started the project about 6-7 years ago, I realized, or I was hoping, that there is a range of options for how to divide the cost. So let me review it very quickly. One option would be letting the donor pay. There is an active donor community, the USA, the KfW, the Dutch, the Japanese. So why not letting them cover the cost of wastewater infrastructure? One option. The second option would be the polluter pays principle, the PPP, which means that the ones who create the pollution should cover the cost. It is quite often described as a moral, as a just solution. And many of the EU directives and white papers coincide with the PPP. And of course, there is the option of beneficiary pay or ability to pay. They do not have to coincide, which means that the one that can afford, the one that would benefit from clean water should pay. And in between, there are other options. For example, equal division of cost. The same way that kids split stuff by 50-50, we can also argue that we can divide the cost like that. So I guess you're asking what is happening along the Israeli-Palestinian border. Wait with that. Let me go through the case of the US-Mexico, because by the time that I started the project, I was a bit optimistic. I was hoping that I can review the American-Mexican case, and then we can learn from the American mistakes, and then I can go to the Israeli policymakers, and I can improve at least my quality of life. So it starts with the Tijuana Basin. I would focus on one particular US-Mexico case, which is the Tijuana Basin. Mexico is the upstream riparian. This is the international boundary. the US is the downstream riparian, and pollution goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And already at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a need to build wastewater infrastructure. So they built a basic infrastructure. And here you could see how the cost has been divided. Again, the polluter pays on one extreme, ability to pay and beneficiary pays on the other extreme. And at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the outfall construction was covered by the US, and the maintenance and operation was equally split. And then, 2 decades later, there was a need to build new infrastructure. So the US suggested, how about we build a new facility here, an integrated facility, and we collect the wastewater all the way to the US. What did Mexico say? No, thank you, it's too expensive, we can do it better. So they built their own facility. You could see a pumping station and a pipeline that should have gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And as to the cost, as you can imagine, it has been divided according to the PPP. Mexico paid for its own wastewater infrastructure. So did it work? So they built their own infrastructure, but then they ran out of money, and the pumping station did not function. So it ended somewhere next to a ravine, and wastewater was going again towards the US side of the border. So the US suggested, let's build an emergency connection. Let's collect the Mexican wastewater. And as to the cost, it was expected that Mexico would cover that cost, but then they said we cannot afford it, so the city of Santiago covered some of the cost. But then the pipeline reached its capacity, and there was a need to find another solution. So the US suggested, let's build an international facility on the US side of the border, and the cost would be only $1 billion. And the cost should be divided according to the PPP, polluter pays principle, which means that Mexico should pay at least half of the cost. What did the Mexicans say? Forget it. Instead, they said we would build our own facility, a new facility in wait, it gets better. A new facility in San Antonio, and a pipeline, and the cost has been divided according to the PPP. It was a Mexican facility. But then the facility did not function. And again, wastewater, as you could see, was running towards the US side of the border. So the US suggested, how about we build detention dams, we capture the Mexican wastewater, and what do we do with that? Next to each detention dam, we build a pipeline, and we send it back to the sender. They called it a return to sender policy. Yes. So did it function? Nature takes its course. Wastewater was running again towards the US side of the border. So here are the defense measures which were covered by the US administration. And then after half a century of negotiation, the US returned back to the historical or to the international facility to be built on the US side of the border according to US technology, but this time the cost sharing would be different. And they suggested a formula of beneficiary pays the difference. What does it mean? It means that Mexico would pay the cost of equivalent to upgrading its existing system, and the difference would be paid by the US, which means that Mexico would pay only 10%, the US would pay 90%, and everyone was happy. Why is that? Because the US administration realized that now the facility would function. It is built according to the US high quality standards, and on top of it, Mexico is no longer or less a free rider. And also the Mexicans were happy because there would be less diplomatic pressure on the US and them. In the last decade, there is no infrastructure built on the Mexican side of the border, And as you could see, the majority of the infrastructure is covered by the US, or either is divided equally between the US and Mexico. It is US funding programs which require matching. So now let's go back to the Israeli-Palestinian case. So you could see that there is a range of options, and quite often they fluctuate between two extremes, ability to pay and polluter pays, and once in a while there is a magical solution that unfortunately could take up to half a century of negotiation that can reconcile these differences or these trade-offs between environmentalism and what is perceived by the US administration as equitable and equity and moral. Let's go back to the Israeli-Palestinian case. So I use the same cost-sharing triangle to the Israeli-Palestinian case. Again, the donor pays, polluter pays, and the two other options of beneficiary and ability to pay. And I examined 3 cases that the cost-sharing has been negotiated. And you could see that in all of them, after the beginning of the Oslo process, it was expected that the donor community would cover the cost. And the donor community wanted to cover the cost, but they wanted very integrated joint facilities that treats wastewater both from the Israelis and the Palestinian sides. The problem with those facilities is that they require deep cooperation. But then there was the outbreak of the Second Intifada, and as you can imagine, cooperation was no longer attainable, but at the same time, local Israeli communities pressured to find a solution. They appealed twice to the Supreme Court, and they started financing their own emergency measures. And then, 5 years later, as you could see, it is funded by the polluter pays, which means that the Palestinian pays. So how come the Palestinian pays? They have less ability to pay. They definitely have less will to pay because they are expected to cover the cost or to pay according to the Israeli high water quality standards. And I would like to finalize with the notion of what I call unilateral environmentalism. What do I mean by that? That is my perception or my take on the Israeli policy. Israel realized that there is no point waiting for the ideal type of solution, which requires deep cooperation. But at the same time, there is a need to take some emergency measures which can be taken unilaterally. So Israel has adopted 3 elements. Let me skip the first one. So the second element is building detention dams on the Israeli side of the border, which is quite similar to the American experience on the Tijuana. And next to each wastewater detention dam, there would be a wastewater facility built according to the Israeli high-quality standards, tertiary treatment, and we have 3 of those on the Israeli side of the border, and you're probably asking, okay, so who pays for it? And that brings me to the idea of the offset mechanism. What is the offset mechanism? It's a legacy of the Oslo process. According to the Oslo process, Israel collects the Palestinian custom tax revenues and once in a month deliver the funds to the Palestinians. But the agreement also allows Israel to hold the money, the funds, and to use it for water provision and electricity provision. So the Israeli cabinet decided 11 years ago to expand the use of the offset mechanism also to wastewater. And just to wrap it up, what do I mean by unilateral environmentalism? Here you could see the elements, the facets of what does it mean unilateral environmentalism, their advantages and disadvantages. For example, unilateral environmentalism would mean an end-of-pipe solution. A solution you could build unilaterally, which means that it has to be built on your own side of the border. On the good side, you can take some measures. But on the dark side, from an environmental perspective, it's a very inferior solution because by the time the Israeli facilities intercept the Palestinian wastewater, 60% already percolates into the underground, because there is about at least 10 kilometers distance between the source of the pollution and the facilities. If you build your own infrastructure, by definition, you're going to deviate from the PPP. You would not expect your neighbor to cover your own infrastructure. On the good side, at least you could do something. But on the negative side, you send a signal to your neighbor that he can free ride. Because now it is up to the Israelis to build those facilities. That's why Israel adopted the offset mechanism, which reduces the motivation of the Palestinian to pollute, but at the same time, if there is an ongoing peace process, I'm not sure it coincides with building trust. Because what the offset mechanism does, it allows you to grab your hand and to pull money out of your neighbor's pocket. And finally, unilateral environmentalism means separation of infrastructure and lack of standardization. Because at some stage, as is happening today, the Palestinians are building or start building their upstream infrastructure. But there is also downstream infrastructure, which will probably be in a different water quality standard. So again, you need standardization, and on top of it, there will be some redundancy of infrastructure. So again, from an environmental perspective, it is problematic. And let me finalize by the rhetorical question of, can unilateral environmentalism be sustained? Is it a long-term viable solution, or is it just a bandage, first aid? So I leave it open like that.
Hi, everybody. Well, we are talking about water since early morning, and all water which is used will turn in wastewater, which is a potential threat to environment or human being health, and a significant threat to existing water resources. I'm going to give you an insight to the Palestinian reality of wastewater. Wastewater from a Palestinian perspective, a little bit different from the perspective offered by Dr. Itai. Let's say I'm going to talk about wastewater collection in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, and then I'm going to talk, or meanwhile, I'm going to talk about wastewater quantities, and then about wastewater treatment in the Palestinian territories during the Israeli occupation over 30 years, and then under the Palestinian era of water and wastewater management. Ongoing activities by the Palestinian National Authority to resolve problems related to groundwater pollution and to wastewater management in different areas still under Israeli occupation, and very little of Palestinian area under Palestinian jurisdiction. Just to mention that in the Palestinian territories, we have control only over 8% of our land, where it is very difficult to manage wastewater services in this 8% of the land. 60% of Palestinian land is still subject to Israeli occupation, where we are not allowed to build infrastructure, not only wastewater management schemes, sewerage networks and treatment plants or treated wastewater reuse schemes, but also roads and other kind of infrastructure. Nevertheless, let's say the wastewater sector in the Palestinian territories have been neglected for over 30 years, almost, of Israeli occupation. Very little or nothing almost has been done by the Israeli Military Occupation Authority over these 30 years of occupation. Only 2 or 3 wastewater treatment plants, small ones, malfunctioning, had been built in Ramallah area, urban Ramallah area, Jenin area, and Tulkarim area. With the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority, and especially the Palestinian Water Authority in 1996, still wastewater sector was neglected. This due to major efforts given by the Palestinian Water Authority to provide water to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who has no drinking water services. Let's say for the time being, about 31% of Palestinians, they enjoy wastewater collection services. If we have a look to this slide, we can see that in urban areas and rural areas and refugee camps are still enjoying, people there living there are still enjoying very little wastewater collection services. I will present another scheme which make it more clear. These figures are perhaps difficult to be seen here, I understand. Yes, let's look to this slide, which wrap up the slide before, which from here we can see that only 31% of the Palestinian community enjoys wastewater or benefits from wastewater collection services. 68% does not have wastewater collection services. They have what we call cesspits or septic tanks. They are just holes made in the ground where wastewater is collected, not treated, and wastewater is seeping, polluting the groundwater and the adjacent environment. 1% of the Palestinian community has no access to any kind of wastewater collection. These are mainly Bedouin communities and remote rural communities. Let's say about the connection always to the sewage network, governorate by governorate in the Palestinian territories. If you can look to the last column, you could see in different Palestinian governorates how much is the percentage of the population which is not served by a wastewater collection system. If you go, for example, for... If you go, for example, for Jerusalem East area, you can see that we have only 65.8, 66% of population connected to the sewerage, not connected to the sewerage network. I don't have it here. This, and to say that this part, thank you, this part of the Palestinian territories is under still Israeli occupation. So here, these are Palestinians who are not enjoying wastewater collection systems, and for sure not wastewater also treatment. That's why those ugly pictures showed in the presentation before, because these are under still Israeli control and Israeli military occupation. Other governorates, for example, Bethlehem area, a rich archaeological area, almost 60% of the area does not have any wastewater management scheme. Not wastewater collection system, not wastewater treatment, only cesspits and cesspools. Some of the pictures showed in the presentation of my colleague before shows untreated wastewater flowing from Bethlehem area toward monasteries and churches and old Roman ruins, let's say. Yeah, here we could see it also again, and from another perspective, in urban, rural, and Palestinian refugee camps. In the Palestinian refugee camps, we have a high percentage of wastewater collected by sewage networks. We don't have it. We have very little in rural areas, and we have, let's say, less than half collected wastewater in the urban areas. Now, if we want to talk about wastewater collection and treatment, we see that the situation is better and good only in Palestinian refugee camps. In, let's say, in urban areas, we have in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Qalqilia, Nablus, Jenin, major Palestinian urban areas. They have totally or partially services to wastewater networks. Many other cities still lack wastewater collection networks, but works have been started in some cities like Jericho, for example, where construction of sewage networks and wastewater treatment plants have been started and expected to start soon, operation. Let's say we have 62% million of cubic meter yearly of sewage flowing without treatment. The figures of my Israeli colleagues shown before talked about 60 million cubic meter. From our perspective, I think we have almost similar figures. But in addition, from a Palestinian perspective, we have 35 million cubic meter of untreated sewage yearly flowing from Israeli settlements, polluting the environment and the shared water resources, which needs also treatment. And let's say in the rural areas, with the areas which suffers more from these services, it's almost 30% of the total Palestinian population living in rural areas. Less than 30 towns or cities in Palestine are connecting partly even to sewerage network, but many projects are coming out. Construction and expansion of sewerage network in Artas. Remember, Artas is the village about which my colleague was talking early in the morning. It is where from, it has to deal with the British mandate and transporting water to Jerusalem and so on. Some other expansion of sewerage networks are ongoing in Baqa al-Sharqiyya, Barta al-Sharqiyya, and Habla in the northern part of the West Bank. Part of them will be connected to Palestinian existing wastewater treatment plants, and other parts will be connected to Israeli existing wastewater treatment plants. Yes, here if we go, let's say, governorate by governorate in the Palestinian West Bank territories, we can look, if you please look to the last column, you can see how much is the percentage of unserved population. Unserved by, I mean, both wastewater collection and wastewater treatments. The figures are quite high, which means that we still need a lot to do. Estimated annual generated wastewater in million cubic meter in the West Bank. If we look always here to the total, this is a high potential to be treated and reused in agriculture toward the saving of freshwater resources even. This is one of the Palestinian wastewater treatment plants, started operation in February 2000 in Albira area, still working, and now it goes under expansion. I recall again, through 30 years of Israeli occupation, only 3 minor wastewater treatment plants were constructed. Now the Palestinian Water Authority and the Palestinian National Authority is doing its best to construct further wastewater treatment plants. Yes. Different wastewater treatment plants has been constructed and under construction. Financial assistance has been provided by Palestinian partners, USA government, European Union, and others. Different wastewater treatment plants will start operation very soon. One of these wastewater treatment plants is in Taiba, Al-Ramoun. We have constructed this plant, started operation since 2 weeks, and will be officially inaugurated on 27th of March of this year. Many other treatment plants have been constructed in the last few years, expanded, rehabilitated in Tulkarem, in Jenin, in Nablus wastewater treatment plant, started operation since a couple of months. It really serves 110,000 people in its first phase, and a lot of wastewater referred to by my colleague Itai flowing to Alexander Valley will not be flowing anymore because of Nablus wastewater treatment plant. There are so many other wastewater collective treatment plants constructed in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank. These are some examples, And these are the status of these treatment plants. Some of them are bad functioning, some of them are functioning, some of them are ongoing continuous rehabilitation. Just to skip these slides. These are all wastewater treatment plants, collective wastewater treatment plants, which have been recently constructed and operational in the Palestinian. Sorry that I don't have pictures of these plants, but yes, we have different advantages for wastewater treatment, which you know. What I would like to stress, wrapping up, is that 60% of the Palestinian West Bank is still occupied by the Israeli government. We are not allowed to build any infrastructure in more than 2/3 or almost 2/3, let's say, of our land. Even small rainwater collection systems of 20-30 collected rainwater constructed in this area is demolished regularly by the Israeli army, denying people to have access to very little of drinking water. Well, the original natural option to solve wastewater issues are not the funds. We don't lack funds. The funds, we have it, polluters pay, and with the polluter pays principle, we have been capable to construct so many wastewater treatment plants. The main issue is sovereignty. The original and natural option to solve wastewater issues is not money. The real option is to finish the occupation, to finish the colonization, to get out of our land, and we will find our way to construct and properly manage our wastewater treatment plants, our wastewater sector, assisted by our partners in the US, EU, and all over. And thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, and I very much want to thank my colleagues because they pretty much said everything that I was going to say anyway. Firstly, if you allow me, because I have a captive audience and I'm the last speaker, I just want to say one or two words about the Arava Institute. First again, thanks to Miri and Rebecca and others for making this very impressive event possible. But the Arava Institute is an NGO located in the south of Israel, and we are an academic and research organization. We're the only organization in Israel that works specifically on regional cross-border environmental problems. And we bring to our campus Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, students from around the world, including, of course, North America. And I want to acknowledge in the audience we have one or two or three of our alumni present here today. What I'd like to talk about, and I think it follows on very nicely from what Alon said and Italian Munther, is the challenge of looking at this wastewater situation as a cross-border one, and resolving this issue really will not only solve a problem that we would view as a Palestinian problem or a problem that we would view as an Israeli problem, but of course we need to think about that this really is a regional situation, and to start looking at this from the level of watersheds, which is also a theme that was developed already by some of the speakers earlier on. Alon very cogently said, and I tend to agree with Alon, that Israel has more or less solved its water supply problem due to the rapid development and the very effective integration of desalination into our water supply infrastructure. And that has allowed, in a sense, a decoupling between the variabilities of climate change and precipitation, and has allowed us in some sense to create a buffer. I would argue that the challenge now facing Israel as we're moving to the 21st century is not about water supply, it's about water quality, and it's about transboundary issues. And the biggest challenge we face with regards to water quality is wastewater, and we've seen that already mentioned by Munther, because the reality simply is that the West Bank is upstream from Israel. If there isn't an effective mechanism for Palestinians or anybody living in the West Bank to effectively deal with wastewater, it is only going to flow downstream. And one response could be, as what Itai was saying, a unilateral response by Israel. But of course, that doesn't really work because it only solves part of the problem. It's an end-of-pipe solution, as I said. And what I'm looking at and what we're beginning to work on at the Institute with colleagues from Palestine, as well as from Israel and the international community, is to try to see where the opportunities might lie within the Palestinian territories that are more source-based and what I would advocate as a decentralized solution to wastewater management and treatment versus, as Martha was showing, some of the difficulties given the ongoing political situation and the ongoing occupation of a centralized approach to wastewater management and treatment. So, these are the challenges. Here you can see one of the watersheds. Itai already mentioned this. This is the Hebron, Basor, Beersheba watershed. And you can see that the upstream section is in the southern West Bank, with Hebron being the largest city in the watershed, close to, if I'm not mistaken, including all the rural villages around, probably 500,000 people, including Israeli settlements in the area. And the close to complete lack of sewage infrastructure, as you saw the tables from Munther, means that untreated wastewater is draining into the system, crossing the green line, resulting in a unilateral response by the Israelis. But this is really, of course, not really going to solve the problem. Once we look at this and say, this is the borders that we need to be relating to here are the watershed. Forget about the green line, forget about the political borders. The way forward is to begin with the watershed and then to think about how we can effectively treat the problem. What this map shows you, the thickness of the line is the amount of flow in the system. This is an indication of year-round sewage. The Hebron watershed in its natural state is a seasonal stream, an ephemeral system that should really only have rainfall in it through the winter time. But because of everything that has already been said, we have now a system that has perennial sewage flowing throughout the region. One point that's also interesting here with this watershed is that where the watershed drains into the Mediterranean, Israel is upstream from the Palestinians, and Israeli wastewater not being treated effectively, mostly due to agricultural runoff, is of course contaminating and flowing into Gaza. Now, in this watershed, what makes it in one sense, a very challenging place to work is we're dealing with some very, very, very problematic wastewater streams. Domestic sewage is actually relatively easy to treat and relatively inexpensive, but what we're facing in this watershed are three main sources of very problematic sewage that are results of very important economic activities for the Palestinian economy. So in the, where's that stick? So this picture is an indication of one of the most important sources of wastewater flowing into the system, which is due to the stone cutting or marble cutting industry and the need for water to cool the soars that are used then to cut the blocks. And the wastewater that is produced here is a very thick slurry, very, very heavy sediment, which no conventional wastewater treatment plant has the ability to treat. The second picture over here is, again, another example of a very important economic activity for Palestine, and that is olive oil production. This is a seasonal activity around October, November, when it's time to pick the olives. You have many, many small, fragmented olive oil mills operating throughout the West Bank, also in Israel. But there's no infrastructure to deal with the sewage. This is a very, very problematic source of a very heavily loaded organic wastewater. And again, if there's no infrastructure, the wastewater is simply draining into the system. And finally, here at the bottom, another important activity is leather tanning. This is very, very important locally in the area of Hebron. And here the problem is that there is a need for a variety of chemicals that are put into the process to soften the leather. Some of these chemicals are known to be carcinogenic. One is chromium 3 and chromium 6, and all of this is going into the environment. So not only do we have a problem of wastewater, we have here some very serious environmental and public health risks, and as already was mentioned by the previous speakers, the lack of infrastructure means that all of this wastewater is almost certainly infiltrating into the groundwater that both parties are dependent on for drinking. So again, a fragmented, a unilateral approach is simply not going to cut it with regards to resolving these issues. And if we don't find a regional watershed-based solution, well then it's lose-lose versus win-win. So some of the critical barriers to why it's so difficult to develop a watershed-based approach to wastewater management, which of course, if you look, that all of us as water experts know that that's the way to do it. Again, has been mentioned, and it's really relates to the political context in which we are finding ourselves. And again, I don't have to go through this because Itai has said we have the pollution praise principle, we have problems with Palestinian capacities, but something that Itai didn't mention, just to sort of contextualize it for you that are not familiar, a lot of this is the outcome of the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords set up two supposedly mechanisms to deal with water, the Joint Water Committee, which was set up as an Israeli-Palestinian technical committee to, for example, approve wastewater treatment facilities or to approve infrastructure. This committee has no ability and was never designed to actually be a policy-making committee, and recently the huge breakdown in trust between the parties has meant that this committee barely functions, if at all. The second, which was also mentioned by Munther, is the simple difficulties that the Palestinians themselves face in planning appropriate wastewater infrastructure due to the fragmentation of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, which was a direct outcome of Oslo. The other challenges, again, I said briefly, so we don't have to go into the very strict wastewater treatment standards developed by Israel, which actually are requiring Israeli treatment facilities to upgrade from secondary treatment to tertiary treatment, which allows for unrestricted use of wastewater irrigation. This is simply being applied or being dictated to by Israel to the Palestinians, but how are you expected the Palestinians to develop these infrastructures when they are faced with severe lack of capacity and international water law in governing to what degree the parties can make use of the water when there isn't really an agreed on mechanism for that to take place. So this map, I think, for those unfamiliar in the audience, sort of relates to that. How can it be 5 minutes already? That's insane. That's crazy. So this is the fragmentation of the West Bank according to Oslo. The yellow is Area A, and this is the only area of the West Bank that is under full Palestinian sovereignty. Now, the challenge here, of course, is when you're thinking about wastewater, like any other environmental service, solid waste management, for example, you don't situate these facilities in the middle of urban centers for obvious reasons. Therefore, the only real place to develop centralized wastewater infrastructure is in Area C, 60% of the West Bank, but controlled by Israel. This, of course, brings in a whole range of obstacles and problems and difficulties in actually getting these kinds of facilities approved. And so in the light of this, what we're trying to adopt is more of a decentralized approach, treating the water at source, which doesn't require high-level interaction between Israeli and Palestinian government officials and can actually be done on the ground by local Palestinians themselves. Pictures. This is a result of untreated wastewater, right? When there's no ability for the parties to develop a mechanism, this is the result. This is in Israel, in the Negev, near a Bedouin village called Batin, where we're also working. This is the same system of the Hebron stream in the West Bank. And what you can see here very clearly is the smoky color is the slurry from the stone cutting. And this picture shows you what happens when you have no water and you have no options. So these are Bedouin communities living in the southern West Bank, and they're grazing and they're watering their goats and sheep in this wastewater. And of course, at some point, those sheep and goats are slaughtered and eaten. So obviously, the public health issues here are quite clear. So we want to adopt a watershed-based approach. But the first thing to think about with a watershed-based approach is data. How badly polluted is the stream? Where is the water coming from? If we don't have a situation of developing a joint database, then we really aren't able to move forward on a watershed-based approach. And I'm running out of time, so now I'm going quickly. Just some preliminary results of our work, and this is thanks to some of the interns from the Arava Institute. We began to map out the watershed, showing you where the large urban centers are, and what is clear from this map is that most of the area is within Israel, but most of the population is in the Palestinian territories. So we began to monitor the stream, and this is also a recognition to Alon and to Musa and to others, because they were the ones that actually first began the study, and we've sort of taken over and hope to continue it. So we began to do in-stream monitoring to both understand surface water and flow and quality and the infiltration into groundwater on both sides of the green line. This is what it requires. If anybody wants to study at the Arava Institute, this is the kind of work that you will be required to do. But you can see we all get down and dirty, and the gray mud that we're busy rolling around in here is again an indication of the heavy industrial wastewater. There was no real liability insurance for us doing this work, but we did it anyway. At the end of the day, we are able to install our technology, our monitoring stations. But we also have to do field work, and again, just some pictures. These are, again, two students from the Arava Institute, Palestinian students, Leila from East Jerusalem and Zubaida from Akko, taking grab samples. This is a project together with Ben Gurion University, and we're analyzing the samples at the lab at Stable Care. This is some of the results from that, and all I want you to take away from this table is firstly, these are the INBAR standards, the very high-level water quality standards for effluent discharge into rivers and streams developed by Israel. But what you can see here, just some indications of pretty much on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side that we are, by orders of magnitude, not even close to meeting the standards. So again, this is the most important slide, perhaps, because it shows very clearly the challenges that we face on the ground. And this is data that has been, as I said, gathered on both sides of the green line. So to end off, because now I've run out of time, one option is to promote a decentralized at-source option. And in actual fact, because of the heavy reliance, mostly in the rural sector of Palestine, on cesspits, as Muntha said, there actually is here an opportunity, because what Palestinians do, because their only option to treat wastewater or to store wastewater is to rely on cesspits, they separate their black water from their gray water. The black water goes into the septic tank or the cesspit, and it may or may not be pumped out at some point. But they separate the black from the gray so that the gray water doesn't cause an overflow of the cesspits. Very little is done to actually make use of that gray water. That is a huge opportunity, because gray water can be treated very easily, quite cheaply, and of course can be reused at source for irrigation. And the reality in the rural villages of Palestine is that most households have access to land and are in many cases relying on subsistence-based agriculture. What their problems are, or where they have difficulties in developing that agriculture, is of course a high quality, reliable source of irrigation water. And this is what we're trying to develop. So we are beginning to install small-scale grey water treatment and reuse systems in a number of villages in the West Bank. And I have to go very quickly now because I've run out of time. But this is in a village in Khalkhul near Hebron. We have here our system, which is a grey water variation of a grey constructed wetland system. And just what you can see here is that this is the outfall pipe from the home of the grey water. And before we came, this grey water was just being dumped, not even being used, and we simply, like a plug and play, we plugged it in, and we're now treating it. I know, I'm finished. So here you see pictures. Okay, I'm the last speaker, so I'm going to take another minute or so. So this was the grey water before it was treated in the septic tank. This is the outcome, treated grey water ready for irrigation. And I want to acknowledge Nati from Netafim, because we're working with Netafim and we're integrating our grey water systems with drip irrigation kits developed by Netafim. Cost-benefit analysis, there's certainly an economic rationale where the user can both save money on water and put that back into the system, and can also generate income by improved agricultural output. And this is my last slide. I promise it's my last slide. There are challenges: acceptability of grey water use, the affordability, scaling it up, connecting not just one house but more houses or a village, effective desalination, sustainability, and of course the elephant in the room is the political situation. Thank you, I'm done.
So I have the fun job of trying to bring this all together. These were a large number of really rich presentations, and what was fantastic about them was that they were very different from the papers that I did receive. Some of them entirely different from those that that were never sent. But what I really enjoyed was the fact that it really got down to nuts and bolts and really concrete issues, and shifted in some ways the dialogue that has been taking place for quite some time when we talk about Israeli-Palestinian water issues at a very high level of water cooperation and conflict, and really getting us to focus more on solutions, challenges to solutions, and some of, very, very technical issues that make us expand what was in our traditional toolkit for when we initially would begin conversations about how does one design a cooperative arrangement. So, I have a few comments here, and then I'm just going to try to open it up because I think there's probably a large number of questions. But, again, what I really was struck by was that when we talk about water, this panel was on water cooperation and conflict, or collaboration, peace building, whatever terms you want to use, is that this is an area where, are you waving at me or? Okay. I just see where water, the Middle East in particular, is where you hear water wars, water conflict more than any other region in the world. It's where you have high-level policymakers always bring it up, but it's also the region where you really have water as a tool for peace more than any other region in the world. And I think some of our presenters today are really embody those endeavors to build deep forms of cooperation given the political situation today that has made cooperation at a formal legalistic level very difficult. Though what was really interesting about these talks was that we were talking about cooperation and collective action, but at the same time, increasingly, we're hearing about unilateral action, countries having to respond independently, which produces solutions that might be optimal for each country or seem rational, but in the end, it still brings up these issues of how do you actually build a solution that is optimal for the collective rather than just for one actor over another. The discussion about unilateral action, what it didn't come up today, which came up in a few of the papers that were sent, was that this was really a form of adaptation. And increasingly, we're hearing more and more about how countries need to adapt, and this is adapting to political realities on the ground, also adapting to climate change, which was something that wasn't mentioned at all, but which is something that is very pressing for this region, given the protracted drought that has been taking place over the last few years. And we're having a discussion about adaptation, but never actually bringing climate change into this conversation. And adaptation has taken the form of desalination, as Alon mentioned. It's taken the form of different treating wastewater, recycling, reuse of wastewater. And in this conversation about adaptation, one of the things I would like, to push the presenters and hear more about is what does this really mean, these types of unilateral adaptation? Because on the one hand, Israel, it could be seen as very proactive. It's become a leader in desalination in these different types of water infrastructure, water technologies. It could also be reactive to a changing climate. But for the Palestinian Authority, for Palestine, it is in some ways, there's forced forms of adaptation, that they have no choice in having to adapt in different ways. So what does adaptation actually mean? Another, what was, I think, really striking about these presentations, and I think this is maybe where I'll open it up, is the solutions that are being presented are really, again, so different than working at this level of negotiations between the parties and having donors in the room, and thinking about it through commodification of water, regional markets, a watershed approach, decentralization. I mean, there's a whole range of topics that were put out on the table. And I think, those solutions, I'm hoping, or those proposed solutions, hopefully will provide a good space for opening up the conversation and for questions for the presenters, especially given these broader dynamics. One that we've heard about, or two things that we've heard about indirectly throughout the day so far, is the changing climate, rainfall and precipitation, but also the refugee issue and how that's putting different pressures on countries such as Jordan, which Alon brought up, with the Jordan water minister saying, can we buy water? I mean, these are not politically easy solutions. And so countries are having to be forced to undertake decisions that would not be politically possible a few years ago, or being forced, or having to think creatively about how to provide water that, in the morning people talked about, that this is a right. People have a right to water, and we need to ensure that people have access to good, clean water and sanitation. So I'm just going to open it up for the audience to ask questions.
I am Amir Marai from Al-Quds University. I have a comment about the comparison between Mexico and the United States and Israel and Palestine. In this case, we have, in the case of United States, we have two independent states with a defined border. In our case, we don't have this defined border. Nobody in this room can define the border of Israel or of Palestine. It's still. So this comparison, I heard it many times, and it makes me sometimes nervous because it's not realistic to have this comparison between our case and the case in the United States. On the other hand, what I want to mention, that the wastewater treatment plant in the West Bank, I know that two of these wastewater treatment plants built under the condition to connect the near settlement to this wastewater treatment plant. One of them is Al-Piri Municipal Wastewater Treatment Plant, and since 1997, this settlement discharged wastewater in this plant, and they do not pay anything until today. So pollutants should pay. It is also okay if it's right if the Israelis give us a permission to build a wastewater treatment plant, for example, west of Nablus. They needed about 15 years to give a permission. So in my opinion, who should pay? The party who hindered or do not give the permission to build the wastewater treatment plant in many cases. On the other hand, for example, RL settlement is about 30,000 people living there, and until today there is no wastewater treatment plant in this settlement. And Salfit city, they want to build a wastewater treatment plant since 1997, and the Israelis don't give them a permission to build this wastewater under the condition that they should connect the settlement with the wastewater treatment plant. So if we speak about the transboundary, it should be defined where is the boundary. In our case, we don't have any. It's not defined the boundary to transfer water from one place to another. So it could be, I don't know what kind of solution that we have.
So what I'm going to ask is, you write down these questions. I want to take a number of questions and then have the panelists respond each one by one to sum up. So I want to find some faces that I haven't seen.
I'm Shachar from Tel Aviv University. My question goes to Alon. I find it very interesting to think or to rethink water as commodity. And you take it a step further, saying that we can decouple the political process or the peace process from the water and start a new age of maybe bargaining of water. But I'm interested to know what you think of how would that change the political situation when the political structure is as is today. As long as there isn't a new structure of power that will change, I think that we can see the same mechanism that creates the reality on ground going once more through this new capitalization of water.
Hi, I just have two very short questions. Can you give a better...
Can we just do one so we can get around the room?
They're very short, I promise. So one is, can you give just a real brief description of drinking water in Palestine? I haven't heard that yet today. And then also, how does rainwater catchment from residential systems play into potable water sources?
Okay, what is the fuel source used for the desalination plants, especially the Ashkelon one? And how will it relate to the new gas findings off the Mediterranean coast? Will that reduce electricity or the water rates? Thank you.
I have a question for Clive. What is the guarantee that those site-based water treatment systems won't be made illegal in the same way that the water catchment systems have been?
So Palestinians since 1992 in every meeting said sovereignty is really important to us. Israeli academics have not taken that up yet. Never, not even once. Can you please tell me why? Really, I mean, it's a political issue for the Palestinians. Why is it not taken up by you as kind of defenders of justice, maybe, or something?
We talk about segregating potable water from gray water, but we talk about wastewater as if it were one thing. But these seem to be at least 5 different streams. The stone cutting refuge could be used to replenish aquifers. It doesn't have to be clogging the sewer systems. Surely we can segregate these?
So I'm going to ask, when the panelists respond, questions, answers relating to desalination, to keep those brief, because the following session is going to go into that topic in much more detail. So you can just whet the appetite.
A very quick answer to my Palestinian colleague. I'm very pleased with the fact that you dislike the comparison with the US and between the US and Mexico and Israeli and the Palestinians. And I will explain why. Because whenever I present my stuff to the Israeli policymakers, they also dislike it. So it's a good start. So and honestly, I think those cases are not identical, but they do share some similarities in the sense that for both of them it's negotiation under an asymmetrical setting, and because of that I think we can gain some insights from the long history of negotiation along the American-Mexican border.
Well, I don't think that Israel and Palestine have fought too much over corn or cement or any other number of items that are easily produced, bought, sold in the world market. Water has had a much more problematic pathology in the discussions, and I don't think it's been a source of war, but it's certainly exacerbated the poor relations. So in that sense, could we possibly reach a situation where we downgraded the issue based on the new reality? I think that wouldn't be a terrible thing. I also think that in terms of issues of justice, which concern me greatly, Israel has a 3-tier pricing system for water. Every family gets a fair amount, a modest amount, at a very inexpensive price. If you want to have a garden in the backyard or something like that, then the price jumps up considerably. And if you want to have a swimming pool, or if you have adolescent daughters like I do who like to take long showers, then you can buy the highest price. But the point is that I think that there are ways that one can work within a system if it's properly regulated with an idea of ensuring water rights and I salute California. I didn't realize till today's talk that it was recognized here. I think that we could make a system if we're thinking about a new relationship. So I'm thinking it's one way to kind of get Trumpy on it, and that brings me to Samer's excellent question, because I can understand your frustration, feeling like, well, we want to talk about sovereignty, but my feeling is on this issue, there's a lot of issues that I might want to raise, which would be difficult for Palestinians to talk about. If I want to talk about, I don't know, Israeli sovereignty over the Etzion block and, south of Jerusalem, I don't think this is going to be a great meeting place there. So the question is, how can we take issues that are fundamentally, at least the rhetoric of them, are going to be divisive, and find ways that everybody gets most of what they want, because that's what negotiations and compromise is about. And I'm hoping that, I don't think sovereignty per se gets us there. There are ways sometimes to circumvent that. For example, Jordan has sovereignty over the Naharaim island, but Israelis can visit there. So I don't mind playing rhetorical games and say, okay, let's say in theory that the Palestinians have full sovereignty over the mountain aquifer. I don't mind signing that as long as I get to a practical solution. But I think that's the real practical solution rather than the symbolic things which interest me, even though I understand the frustration of people that these symbolic things are very, very important. I don't know if that was the kind of answer you want, but I'm just speaking from my own sense. And if you notice, I am very concerned that Palestinians feel that they have an independent source of water that they can control. That's sovereignty. That's what I think that the Palestinians want fundamentally, and I think they should have it, and we can find a way to get it to them. Finally, with regards to desalination, I've written an article about this, so I can send it to you, but basically there are 3 major environmental concerns that we might want to think about in terms of desalination that sort of make this magic bullet less than totally magical. The first is the fact that it takes up beach space, and I think that thus far in Israel, due to some fairly clever juxtapositions between desal plants and existing infrastructures, largely electrical generation facilities, there has not been that much of a loss of beach space, but that's one of the concerns. The second is the discharge of the brine, which contains antiscalants, which might cause a problem. Some people think they may actually be good for the nutrient-poor Mediterranean. And the third, and the real serious one, I think, is the issue of energy. Countries like Australia have begun to address this by pairing desalination with renewable energy projects, so there'll be a carbon neutral project. How I wish that the Israeli environmental movement had been vociferous in demanding on this, and so we would pay 60 cents or 65 cents for the desalinated water rather than the 55 cents. But with regard to the question about what is the power source, the Ashkelon plant is different. They have a cogeneration facility which is based on gas, which we have a lot of. The rest comes from the conventional electrical system, the grid, but I think very soon will be largely a gas system. So it may all be in gas, and people say, oh, this is great, but let's not forget that gas is not, there's no free lunch. It's still 50% of coal. So if our electricity consumption goes up 3.5% every year, even though natural gas will certainly reduce our carbon footprint, it will not eliminate it.
Okay. Yeah. Water resources and drinking water resources. Let's say main water resources in Palestine and Israel are coming from groundwater resources, mountain aquifer, and from surface water coming from River Jordan. And now coming also from desalination, which is highly encouraged, especially after gas discovery. So energy is costing less, and perhaps desalination is costing less, and there is an additional source of water. For us, Palestinian, let's say our groundwater resources are extracted by Israel. It's almost completely controlled by Israel. We are benefiting only from 18% of our groundwater resources. And these 18% of our groundwater resources, it's also extracted by Mikirot, the Israeli Water National Company, and it is sold to us. So our own water resources are extracted by the Israeli government and sold to us at a higher price than paid by other Israeli settlements built illegally in the Palestinian territories or to any other citizen, Israeli citizen living in Israel. Let's say Water coming from Jordan River is not at all used by Palestinians. We are neglected our water rights to surface water coming from River Jordan, even though internationally recognized these water rights, but unfortunately neglected by the Israeli government, by the Israeli occupation. In general, let's say to give a quick idea, in Palestinian urban areas, especially in southern Palestinian area, south of Hebron, where more than 500,000 Palestinians are living, water, Palestinians access water in these urban areas sometimes once a month, sometimes once each 2 months even. There is not a regular water supply, even though near by Israeli settlement in the Gush Etzion and in the Kiryat Arba area, they are consuming 390 liters per capita per day. Nearby Palestinian urban areas, they are consuming 20 liters per capita per day, which is far below the limit fixed by the World Health Organization. This is a very quick brief about water situation in Palestinian territories.
To relate to what Amr was saying about the boundary or the border or whatever we want to call it, it's essential that means that there has to be, at some point, there has to be a peace agreement, and there has to be, that will, solidify the border wherever it may be. But I think that in the situation we are in now, where no one really knows when or if there'll ever be a peace agreement, when it comes to water, the boundary should be, as I was trying to say in my talk, the watershed. And if we can focus on the watershed as the hydrological boundary and manage water according to those boundaries, then I think we can get to resolve some of the issues jointly. I also want to say a word or two about the settlements, because it was also raised, and no question that there are a huge problem, mostly the isolated settlements, where they too are polluting the environment, and they too don't have access or connection to, many of them are not treating their sewage. And the case of Ariel and Salfit is a very, very, very good one, and there's no question that that is a contribution to they're contributing to the problem. In terms of the question on the legality or the authorizations for the grey water systems that we're building at the moment in the West Bank, we are building only in Area A. And Area A, because it's under full Palestinian Authority, we are not required to meet any Israeli standards whatsoever. But we obviously have to work according to Palestinian Authority guidelines, and we do. We work very close. All of our systems are in full consultation with the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Water Authority. Just one word about grey water treatment in Israel. It is not legal. There is no ability to treat grey water in Israel at a local level, and that's because the Israeli policy is to treat at a centralized level wastewater and not to separate black water from grey water. And I think that should the Palestinians follow the Israeli model, or should they think about something different? I would advocate that they should think about something different, at least in certain cases where they actually have an opportunity over the Israelis, because they do separate their black and grey water. And so in other words, they can look at centralized systems in certain places, and they can look at decentralized systems in other places. In terms of the question on what we can maybe do with some of this more problematic hazardous waste, there are many options. One of the issues with stone cutting is not that you should send it to a treatment facility, but you need to collect as much as you can from all the various stone cutting industries. And again, they're very fragmented, very small, family-run businesses. Find a mechanism where they all contribute to a centralized settling pond or series of ponds. The sludge, the sediment sludge, if it's relatively inert chemically, you can landfill it. You can use it as a source of construction material. And there are some projects now being conducted that I know of, sponsored by USAID, that are looking at that. Olive oil waste too. You can take olive oil waste and convert it into things like soaps. So again, there are ideas and opportunities to treating those hazardous waste and actually benefiting from that. Yeah, I think that's
Thank you.